It happened on a crisp October day in 1918. Little 5-year-old Kay and his friend were playing in front of the house on Tabernacle Street.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman Hafen, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie Spirit. I've always been haunted by particular places and the stories connected to them. Riding in the truck with my dad as a little boy, Dad could tell me a story associated with most of the houses or vacant lots or fields around town. I've always associated stories with places and places with stories. In today's episode, I'd like to key on one specific place, a house on Tabernacle Street that still stands among all the modern buildings that have risen out of the ground all around it in recent years. The St. George townscape has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. We've lost too much of the physical past. It's my hope that we can at least retain some of the stories associated with those lost places. For help with this, in today's episode, I'm turning to my 92-year-old father, Kelton Hafen, who grew up on Tabernacle Street. But first, let me share a couple of stories. This is a piece called On Any Sunday Evening. For as long as I can remember, Sunday evenings have been a time for reconnecting with loved ones. When I was a little boy, our family would hop in the car after Sunday dinner and drive up Flood Street, turn west on Tabernacle, and park at the curb in front of Grandma and Grandpa's house between 1st and 2nd East. As much as I adored my grandparents, I can't say I looked forward to those visits. They were often long and tedious for a kid with nothing more to do than sit quietly on a wooden chair and count the ticks of the old clock on the mantel, while adult voices filled the warm parlor with a jumble of words. I didn't know it then, but my parents were establishing a pattern for me with those Sunday evening visits, a pattern that continues in my own family a half-century later. Not all my visits to Grandma's house were as sombered and staid. Sometimes when we went there on weekdays, I got to climb the steep and narrow stairs to the bedrooms where my father and his 11 brothers and sisters grew up. I remember a screened porch where Dad said they slept on sweltering summer nights, and I remember how scary it was to step through the door from the kitchen down into the dark, dank, rock-walled cellar. I was fascinated by how Grandma cooked on a wood-burning stove, and I felt proud when she'd ask me to bring in an armful of wood from the box just outside the back door. Then she'd let me rustle in the bread bin, where I might find a piece of fresh homemade bread to munch on. That house still stands on Tabernacle Street, Of all the grand old pioneer homes that once lined that street, Grandma's is the only one still standing. It is now the headquarters of Info West. And I'll insert here that this piece was written probably 20 years ago. And Info West is no longer there, but they were at the time this was written. Info West was the pioneer of internet companies in southern Utah. Every time I drive past it, I remember those Sunday evening visits and how long they seemed, though I'm sure they rarely lasted more than an hour. I remember how natural it was to make that visit, as natural as going to sleep at night and waking up in the morning. It was part of the eternal round of life in my world. The need for one human being to connect with another is as old as mankind. All around us lay rocks with 1,000-year-old messages inscribed on them. For centuries, the handwritten letter kept friends and loved ones in contact. The invention of the telephone shot us light years forward in the constant quest to communicate. Then came cell phones and email and texting, instant communication, anytime, any place. I was slow to embrace much of the new technology, but I must admit there is one newfangled communications tool that has become indispensable for me. It's called FaceTime, and it's the miracle that makes it possible for people a mile or 5,000 miles apart to see and talk to each other at the same time. For a family spread across the country, as ours now is, I can think of nothing better than to hook up live and see and talk to each other at the same time, especially when your grandkids are the cutest ever born. Last Sunday evening, we had 3 live video feeds on our computer screen at once. Simultaneously, we saw and talked to our newly married daughter and her husband in Boston, our oldest son, his wife, and our 6-year-old granddaughter in Bloomington, Indiana, and our second son, his wife, and 2 little boys in Richland, Washington. It was perhaps the most memorable Sunday evening visit of my life. For a set-in-his-ways guy like me, who grew up thinking he could talk to his friends through empty soup cans connected with string, it was quite an experience. But the part that really gave me pause was the moment when I remembered that I am an InfoWest customer. Suddenly, I realized that as an InfoWest customer, the connection making this Sunday evening miracle possible was running right through Grandma's old house on Tabernacle Street, through the very house where I sat on those endless Sunday evenings a half-century ago, listening to the old clock tick on the mantel. This piece is called The House on Tabernacle Street. That house was just another home in a long row of beautiful residences along a tree-lined avenue. Now surrounded on both sides of the street by modern office buildings, it stands resolute and somewhat lonesome in the middle of a bustling downtown, an island of memory amidst a sea of progress. It is the house from which my grandfather walked to his classroom at Dixie College, just a couple of blocks away, every morning for 40 years. And it's the house where my grandmother patiently and competently raised the 12 of her 14 children who grew to adulthood. It is a house that for much of the 20th century brimmed with the kind of simple joy that could not be bought with money. And it was a house that, through it all, ached with the underlying pain of unbearable loss. My grandmother's name was Orilla Woods Hafen. She was born in 1891 in a pine-board cottage at the foot of a hill next to a lush meadow in Clover Valley, Nevada. Her Latter-day Saint pioneer grandfather had settled that green-carpeted valley in 1869, and built the one-room school church where she studied and worshiped as a bright and beautiful girl. When she was a teenager, a boy peddling fruit from Santa Clara chanced his way into the valley. He was handsome and charming, and she was quite taken by the slender young man at the reins of a wagon bearing bushels of luscious peaches. In the fall of 1910, after she had ridden the train to Provo to attend college at BYU, the two crossed paths again. Grandma's long courtship with Arthur Knight Hafen began that year. They were married in the fall of 1912. By 1915, they had moved into the handsome gabled house on Tabernacle Street and were the parents of a boy named Kay, a daughter named Karma, and another son named Farrell. Grandpa had embarked upon what would become a distinguished career as a professor of the humanities at Dixie College, and Grandma was well on her way to becoming the mother of the century in St. George. In the summer of 1917, my Aunt Ada joined the family. In less than 5 years, Grandma had given birth to 4 children. Her childbearing years would continue through the Great War, the Roaring Twenties, and into the Depression, when my father Kelton was born in 1932, and the baby, Donald, finally arrived in 1933. 9 of those siblings are still living, most of them in St. George. And again, I'll insert here that this piece was written about 20 years ago, and so now, as it stands, my father, Kelton, at 92 years old, is the last remaining living child of Grandma. If you had had the chance to visit with any of them, they would tell you of a mother who had loved them unconditionally, who cooked for them over a wood stove, the same stove next to which she bathed them in a No. 2 tub. They would tell you how she washed a perennial stream of diapers, kept a large and bounteous garden, celebrated every birthday in high style, entertained a parade of guests from all walks of life at her dinner table, cleaned and shopped and tended the neighbors' kids. They would tell you how she did all this and much more and still managed to read to them at bedtime, though she often dozed before finishing the first page. And they will tell you how they never heard a bitter word fall from her mouth. I remember visiting Grandma and Grandpa in that house on Tabernacle Street. They were elderly by the time my memories began taking shape. On perfect summer evenings, we would sit out on the porch and visit in the still, close air. On dark winter nights, we would sit in the front room as a fire crackled in the cast iron stove. I would sit quietly and listen to my grandmother's musical voice and swell with joy at the sound of her unique clucking laughter. That laugh, which for me is the sound of pure compassion, still vibrates through my heart. I recall often looking up at a picture on the wall of the front room. It was a softly tinted portrait of a little boy standing in a pastel blue suit with short pants. The sandy-haired boy is profoundly handsome. He stands in an earnest pose, as if yielding to the wishes of his mother, an ever so slight grin on his face. It is grandmother's firstborn child, Kay. He is maybe 4 years old, and I realized that this may well have been the last photo ever taken of him. On Memorial Day each year, I try to visit the St. George Cemetery. There I can walk to the grave of my grandmother Hafen and read on her stone that she died in 1983, 12 years after my grandfather, who lies next to her. Nearby is a little white stone with a lamb sculpted upon it. The stone is weathered and chipped by the many decades that have passed since it was lovingly placed there. It happened on a crisp October day in 1918. Little 5-year-old Kay and his friend were playing in front of the house on Tabernacle Street. A team of horses pulling 2 large freight wagons lumbered down the street. The boys caught the driver's attention and convinced him to give them a ride on that wonderful big rig. The driver stopped and allowed the little adventurers to climb aboard. The boys gleefully rode the wagon down Tabernacle Street until it turned abruptly at 4th East, just north of where the Sun Bowl would later be built. They must have realized by then how far they'd strayed from home and suddenly felt compelled to turn back. Kay's friend jumped first and easily cleared the wagon's giant rear wheel. When Kay jumped, he did not clear the wheel, and the huge arc of iron rolled over him. His precious life ended in an instant. I cannot imagine the grief that engulfed the house on Tabernacle Street through the ensuing cold fall and winter. I only know that somehow, through a miracle of faith and sheer courage, my grandmother arose from her bed of anguish, put on her apron, and went back to her calling as mother. Graciously and gloriously, she continued in that calling through all the long days of the next 6 decades. There would be more days of loss and sorrow, but there would be even more days kept with the joy and satisfaction of raising a fine and solid family. As new parents ourselves, my wife and I often visited Grandma during her final days on earth. Each time we walked out of her presence filled with grace and good advice and renewed hope that we would somehow be able to face whatever lay ahead. I'm honored today to be sitting here in the studio with my dad, Kelton Hafen, who's 92 years old. He's the last, as mentioned in that story, of a family of 14 children still with us. We as a family feel so blessed that he is with us and that he can share with us so many wonderful things about a time that we can only dream about or imagine. Dad was born in 1932, and he grew up in that very house on Tabernacle Street. And I wanted to ask you today, Dad, if you could just share some of your memories, some of your thoughts and feelings about that house, about that street, and what that all meant in your life.
Well, I'd like to start maybe before I can remember. A big share of my siblings were born in that house. There was a lady by the name of Sister Harridance that was a midwife, and she took care of Mother with most of her births. So I was born on Tabernacle Street, but it was about 350 west at the Harridance home, and that is across the street south from where the Smith Market now sits. And one of the things Mother told me was that when I was born, Dr. Lyman was the attending physician, and at that time, my father was bishop of the old St. George East Ward. There were just 3 wards, East, West, and South Ward in St. George, less than 2,500 people in population. And the way she knew she had had a son was Dr. Reitman said, well, it looks like we have a little bishop's counselor. And she didn't realize it would be about 68 years later before that actually happened. But anyway, I tell this story because, Mom, the McGregor Hospital was just around the corner from us at the time, and we had a lot of reasons during my lifetime to attend the McGregor Hospital, but she felt like she wanted to have Sister Harridance attend her. And another thing that I might add, a little personal, but when I was about 2 years old, my brother Ken was a year older than me, and my brother Don a year younger than me. And it was at the time of year when, of course, she had cooked on a wood stove, but she needed to have a little bit of heat in the house as well. She had got Ken up and dressed. She had got Don up and cleaned up and back in bed, and I was just playing on the floor. And
You were 2 years old?
that's, yes. And so she took Ken and went out to get some more firewood. Before she got back in, she heard me screaming. And so she hurried, and I was against the door. She had to push me away from the door, and when she came in, I was on fire. I apparently had had a bit of a cold. They put on what they called a mustard plaster around your neck, and of course that was flammable material. And somehow or another, I must have picked up a match, struck it, and held it up to my neck, and that caught on fire. So she burned her hands trying to get me taken care of, but for the rest of my life, I've had scars on my neck and on my chest and my arms. The doctors at that time, they got the doctors from the hospital to come over. But things were different then. They thought that you wrap people up and put an ointment on, and that actually kept the heat in. And nowadays, they try to get all that heat out by putting on ice or cold packs. But then that held it in, which, of course, made that more. So when I got the rest of my life, I've had these scars, which I've never paid much attention to, but I'm sure that most people, the first time they see me, probably wonder what happened to me.
It's for me, whenever I walk into that house now, and it's now more of a building or an office building, but I can walk into that front room and I can see the doorway into the kitchen, and what I see is my dad as a 2-year-old on fire right there in that doorway. It's, to me, that those are the kinds of things that there are so many stories tied to so many places that we really don't know the things that have occurred in a place. And I think that as we think about Tabernacle Street, it would be so awesome if you could share some of the stories or some of the memories, the people, the homes that existed along that street.
all the people in St. George, most everyone raised their own vegetables and had their own garden. And we had water turns down the street. Some people still use the water and grow vegetable gardens now, but almost everyone did then. And so I remember spending time in the garden, either weeding or taking care of what needed to be done. Dad would have to get up all hours of the night or during the day whenever his water turn came and took care of the irrigating. So that was one of the things.
That garden that is now that was probably a quarter-acre garden or bigger.
I don't suppose more than a quarter acre, maybe.
It's now a parking lot for a federal building on the corner there. Mm-hmm. But then directly behind the house, you had a barn.
Yes, we had a barn. We had several dairy cows, or milk cows, I should say, about 4 Jersey cows that from the time we were old enough, would have to milk, and then we would sell milk around the neighborhood to people that didn't have a milk cow.
Did you milk morning and night?
We milked morning and night. We had small farms down in the valley. If you go down 400 south to the freeway, we had a farm about where the freeway goes through now. And we put up a lot of our hay and whatnot to feed our cow. However,
this is a family living in downtown on Tabernacle Street, where the father is a professor at the college, but you also have a farm that you as a family are taking care of.
Yes. And besides the farm, we would go to Santa Clara or up on the Ivans Bench. Santa Clara is where my grandfather raised fruits and vegetables. He had a good orchard and raised hay. Upon the bench, my Uncle Guy had a farm where he raised wonderful melons, the best melons you've ever tasted, but he had alfalfa fields. We would help put up the hay and take a little hay as pay for that. So that's how we took care of our farm animals.
So coming back to the barn in the backyard, even in downtown St. George, most of the homes had a barn.
That's right. In St. George, they were large lots, very few houses on each block. Large lots, and most of the barns back in behind our house. Four-Masters had a barn, Stratton's had a barn. They were all kind of built close to each other. And, of course, besides the milk cows, we would have pigs, chickens, and things like that, beef to kill. And so...
You also had a basketball standard in the backyard. Can you tell me what happened to that?
Well, we had a basketball standard, and sometimes when we were playing ball and Dad wanted us to work in the garden or do something else, we weren't real fast to stop the game and do what we should. So Dad got a little impatient one time and brought the axe and chopped the basketball standard down. My father was a great man, a good man, but he was a little bit impatient, so much different than my mother. My mother never had an impatient bone in her body. And I hope that most people can feel that way about their mothers, because she was the ultimate as far as, and my mother-in-law comes along just the same way. But Dad wanted us to do work and take care of things, and if we were a little slow to do it, he sometimes lost his patience.
So you were just a little boy during the height of the Depression from 32 till the war in 41. Yeah. And then you were you were just 9 or 10 years old when World War II broke out. As you lived on that street during the 30s, 40s, and then after the war, what did you see, or how were things different during those years?
We didn't have a lot of toys. We didn't get a lot of stuff for Christmas. Mostly, we would get clothing that we needed to get us on through the school year. But so for a lot of my entertainment, we had what we called bony horses. They were animals that had died. Certain bones from the animal represented different animals, and we would go out the side of the house, build corrals out of string and sardine cans. We would make a wagon to pull our. So we just, by the hour, that's what I enjoyed doing. When I was young, my main interest anyway was livestock, ranching, and farming. The ranching was more enticing to me, but farming kind of had to go along with it to make your ranch work, so I did that. But anyway, those were the kind of things we did. As we grew up and the war started, we had several of our young men that were probably just about 8, 9 years older than me, had joined the National Guard, and they were called out to go to war. I had a brother-in-law, Phil Squire, a couple of my sisters had boyfriends that were involved, and I remember on the south side of the Tabernacle going and being there with a big group of people, most everybody in St. George, when they were called and sent away. And of course, from then on, all of the young men from around 18 on up were drafted into the Army. So from the time of about 1940, 41 through 45 or thereabouts, all of the young men were gone. We had rationing. Food was hard to get. Sugar was hard to get. Gasoline, you could only get so much. And to me, as a young boy, that didn't really bother me that much, but it changed the culture and the way people were able to live during that time. They sold war bonds. Everybody bought war bonds.
Now, you had 2 or 3 older brothers who served
Yes.
in the war as well.
Yes.
who grew up in that house?
I had brothers and brother-in-laws that were in the war. I had my oldest brother was married and had a family. Had 2-3 children, and he was finally drafted. But it was about the time the war was over, and then my older brother Eldon and he went in the Army together. But the war got over by that time, and they were sent to Germany as an occupation force. My brother Herschel was in the real thick of things. He was in North Africa, went to Sicily, through Italy, and was over there for several years. And that he was in the most of the real hard fighting. But yeah, there were several of our family involved in that.
Do you recall the emotions in your family, Grandma, and as they were gone, but then also as they came home?
Well, of course, there was a lot of anxiety with everyone gone. We did have a few relatives that were killed during the war, so that added to some of the problem. Some of our neighbors lost boys in the war. I would have only been 8, 9 years old at the time, somewhere in there, so I didn't feel the same emotion that I know all of the older folks went through.
But the day did come when you left that house on Tabernacle Street and went to Korea.
That's right. I was in the Korean War for just 3 months before. I was in the infantry, and I was sent right straight to the front line, and I was there for 3 months before the war ended. However, our National Guard, after they came back from World War II, were sent to Korea earlier, and our National Guard went through a lot more traumatic times than I did. So I had a brother-in-law and many friends that were involved in that. I didn't mention our neighborhood growing up. It was a typical neighborhood of any other neighborhood in St. George. There were young kids and people our age that lived within just a block or two radius of where we were. We had a real good social life with everyone in the neighborhood. We in the evenings we get together, visit or play various games, and a different world than what we have today. Everybody associated with everybody else. I might go back a little further. When there were actually a couple of hotels in St. George, but we had relatives and friends that lived in Enterprise, Gunlock, Mesquite, or different places. When they came to town, they didn't plan on staying in a motel or hurrying in and hurrying back home. They had to stay overnight. And so in our home, although the folks had all the children that they also very seldom ate a meal without friends or relatives from out of town being with us, and we would make room for them if they wanted to stay over. social life back then was so good and so important. And nowadays, a close relative will come through town, but they're in too big a hurry to even say hi. Back then, you got to spend a lot of time with everybody, and you got acquainted with everybody in the area. And to me, that was one of the most important parts of my growing up, was to be acquainted and know most everybody in town and most everybody from all the outlying areas that came to town. I, as a kid, a lot of times would walk uptown and just walk around. There were some characters in town, some of them that would sing little songs and different things like that. And I just enjoyed being around everybody. And
So we're here today on a day when it's maybe 112 degrees outside. How did you enjoy that as you were growing up on Tabernacle Street on those 112 degree days?
Okay, the heat was just natural to us. We could go down in our basement and get a little relief. And by the time I came along, there were a lot of trees in town, and you could go from one shade tree to another and get by. But it was the natural thing for us. We didn't really pay that much attention to it.
Can you just talk about your memories of him as a college professor and that life that he lived on Tabernacle Street?
Well, I never was a good student. I never did like school. I was an out-of-doors type fellow. So consequently, when I got to college or to high school, I didn't take any classes from my father. One, because I didn't want him to see how stupid I was, I guess. And two, because I didn't want to embarrass him, because I wasn't a very good student. But I've had many people over the years tell me how important the things that he taught and in school and the way he handled things was to them. How, you know, a good school teacher probably has more good influence on people than about anybody there is. Church people have a good influence on you, but if a good school teacher really...
Speaking of that, were there teachers at elementary and at Woodward that stand out in your mind?
Well, I remember all of my teachers, and I had a lot of respect and admiration for all of them. There was a lady named Linda Lawson. She never married, but she was just one of the sweetest, nicest people there ever was. Yeah, most anyone that knows any of the history of Washington County has heard of A.K. Lawson. She was a sister to A.K. Lawson. And she was a lot the same nature as my mother. Everything she did seemed perfect. She was completely genuine and nice and trying to be helpful all the time to everybody. And she was one teacher that
Where did she live? in as it relates to your neighborhood?
She lived in the town of Washington because the Lawson family was from Washington. So she traveled to St. George back and forth each day. But
were there people? Well, you've already mentioned that there were characters and there were people in town that you interacted with. Were there people right in your neighborhood there on Tabernacle that were interesting characters, or people that you had encounters with that you recall?
Not right in the neighborhood. Across the street from where I lived, there was what we called Aunt Stella MacArthur. She was from Pine Valley originally, and Dunk MacArthur lost his wife, and he married her, and then Dunk was killed, and she lived there as a widow, and she was just a great neighbor. Her and Mom and I exchanged a lot of times, and the one experience I remember is she got old and got bedridden, and she called the house and told me that her brother Olaf, who was living with her, she was in bed and she needed some help, and she called for Olaf and called for him, and he didn't respond, and she asked me to come over. I went over and walked in the house, and he was sitting in the front room in a nice chair, dead. He had passed away. That's one kind of thing.
You mentioned some of the characters in town and some that would sing songs. Is there a particular person or a song that you remember?
This one old guy, he sang a lot of songs. It was, this isn't necessarily one you'd tell in church, but he would sing, leather breeches full of stitches, leather breeches button on. My wife, she kicked me out of bed 'cause I had my leather breeches on. Leather breeches full of stitches, leather breeches button on. My wife, she kicked me out of bed 'cause I didn't have my leather breeches on. Now, it looks like to me the lady was pretty hard to please. And different things like that. Moose Pace was a little younger than me, but his grandma Pace, they were involved. They had businesses there in town, so she had Moose with her all the time, and she would have Moose sing songs for everybody in town that would stop and listen. Moose did become a guitarist, and he played Western music and was well known in the Western circles as a guitar player and a singer. So different things like that. I'm guessing around 1915, which was quite a while before I was born, my father wrote the Dixie College School Song, and that school song was used clear up until the name of the college was changed from Dixie to Utah Tech. And so that song was used, and was Earl J. Blake was our band leader, and he was a very enthusiastic man. And that song was played, and in the beginning of every basketball game and football game, and it just really got the spirit of Dixie boiling in people. And so that's one of the things Dad did. Now, Dad had 14 children that he was responsible for. His wife was the one that took care of us and nurtured us, and my older sisters were all real good to help. But Dad had to do everything he could to make a few extra dollars to keep us going. He was a writer. He wrote for the Deseret News. He was a bookkeeper. He took care of the books for several of the irrigation companies in the area, and he did a lot of extras like that. He also, as a boy, had been what they call a peddler. The Santa Clara people raised their fruits and vegetables and took them out to the outlying towns and sold them. So he had been involved in that. So he, if we had some extra carrots, or he would go to Enterprise and buy several sacks, 100-pound sacks of potatoes, bring them down here and sell them to different cafes and around to make a few extra dollars that way. So as I became older and he was getting older, I drove him around a lot when we did a lot of these kind of things. It wasn't something that I particularly enjoyed, but I appreciated the fact that he was able to do extra things to make us have a comfortable living. Nobody in St. George that I can think of would have been considered wealthy, but I never had to worry about something to eat or something to wear or something, I always had the necessities of life, and it was because Dad did extra.
At the same time, you were always expected to do your part.
That's right. There were several times in my life when on Saturdays I would like to be off with the boys getting into some mischief. And Dad had me working in the garden, and so I missed out on some of those things. Not all of them, but some of them. And so as I look back on it now, I did develop a work ethic, and I felt like that a person, regardless of their education, should be doing something. If it was cleaning the corrals, if that's all they could get to do, they should be doing it. Everybody should be earning and producing something, and that was always taught to me, and I appreciate it.
And those are universal values, and all of that. Everything we've talked about is no different than in any other community in America during the 30s, 40s, 50s. However, I'd love to just have you talk about what it is or why it is that Utah's Dixie is special and maybe different in some ways.
Well, I've always said, if I never had to go anywhere more than 200 miles in any direction from my home in St. George, I could be the happiest man in the world, because I was among the best people, I think, that on earth. I was doing the things I love to do, and some people love to travel. I've told people, I've been as far east as Denver, Colorado. I've traveled quite a lot in my life. Other than when I was in the Army, I was in Korea. But anyway, I've never felt like, to me, St. George, Utah's Dixie, is, of course, we've got the ranch at Clover Valley where Mom was born and raised, and that to me is heaven on earth. But there's something about the spirit in Utah's Dixie that has given me everything that I've ever wanted, and probably a lot more. I've had friends that were making a lot of money. I mean, making good money, that had to go get out in the hills with me to relax and enjoy life. And I've been able to do that most all of my life. So I've never had, as far as dollars are concerned, my living standard has probably always been in the poverty level, but I've never felt like I needed any more than what I've had. And Utah's Dixie, to me, is the ultimate place in the whole world because of the people and the experiences and the history that's gone on here. To me, it can't be beat anywhere.
Dad, thanks for sharing these things. As you've talked today, and as we've sort of centered this around the house on Tabernacle Street, I just feel like what you've just shared, the heart of all of that begins in that house that still stands there on Tabernacle Street, and how grateful, how blessed we are that that home is still there among all the other buildings that surround it now. It still stands there, and I hope it can always stand there as a reminder of everything that you've just shared with us. So thank you.
Well, thank you for being interested.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath. I've had the chills and fever till I'm nearly shook to death. All earthly tribulations know that there are others who will come here after me, though I may never see it as a garden lined with trees. If this desert's gonna blossom, I'd better plant the seeds.